The coffee had gone cold by the time I noticed. That's the kind of detail you remember later. Not the big things. Not the moment everything changed. But the small, stupid ones. Cold coffee. A paper cup with a lipstick mark on the rim that wasn't mine. I was sitting at my sister-in-law's kitchen table, the one she'd had shipped from some boutique furniture place in Vermont. And I was watching her talk with her hands the way she always does when she's performing for an audience. Even when the audience is just me. Her name is Bridget. She married my brother Caleb 3 years before he died, and in the 14 months since the accident she has called me exactly twice. The first time was to ask about the life insurance paperwork. The second time was to invite me to this lunch. I should have known. My daughter Rosie was with my neighbor that afternoon, 7 years old, obsessed with dinosaurs and convinced she could speak to her cat in complete sentences. I'd promised her we'd go to the park when I got back. That's what I was thinking about when Bridget set the salads down and said, so casually it almost didn't register, "I've been talking to a lawyer about Rosie." I didn't say anything. I picked up my fork. "Just exploratory," she added. Caleb would have wanted me to eat my salad, I said. She laughed. The laugh didn't reach her eyes. That was when my phone buzzed on the table. I'd left it face up, which I never do. The notification was from a number I didn't recognize. No area code I knew. The message was 4 words. "She has someone here." I read it twice. My eyes went up before I could stop them. A reflex. And I caught myself. Looked back down. Took a bite of salad like nothing had happened. Bridget was still talking. Something about how it would be better for Rosie to have stability, extended family, a 2-parent household. Her husband Thomas was quiet in the way he always is, sitting at the far end of the table, doing that thing where he looks at his phone while pretending he isn't. I was scanning the room the way my father taught me when I was a teenager and we'd go camping. Look for what doesn't belong. He was a retired detective. He used to say the most dangerous things are the ones hiding in plain sight. The living room opened off the kitchen. Open plan, lots of natural light, Bridget's taste everywhere, white and gray and a few strategic plants she'd seen on some interior design account. On the console table near the window, there was a small arrangement of dried flowers in a dark vase. I'd seen it before, but today the vase was positioned differently, turned slightly toward the table, toward where I was sitting. It was a small thing, the kind of thing you'd dismiss if you weren't already on alert. I didn't dismiss it. I made myself finish the salad. I laughed at the right moments. When Bridget said she was only doing this because she loved Rosie, I said I understood. When Thomas offered more water, I held out my glass and said thank you, and when I excused myself to use the bathroom, I walked slowly, touched the wall on the way like I always do, and counted to 15 before I turned around and came back. On my way through the living room, I got close enough to see the small lens. It was barely visible, pressed into the floral arrangement, the size of a shirt button. A spy camera. The kind you can order online for $40. I went back to the table and I finished my lunch. In the car I sat for 6 minutes before I started the engine. I needed to think, and I needed to do it without my hands shaking on the wheel. The text. Someone had warned me. Someone who knew what was happening in that house and wanted me to know too. I didn't recognize the number, but they'd timed it almost exactly, right before I would have reacted to what Bridget said, right when it mattered. I drove to the park even though Rosie wasn't with me. I just sat on a bench near the swing set and watched a kid in red sneakers pump her legs back and forth, trying to get high enough to see over the fence. The camera meant they were building something. You don't set up a recording device for a casual lunch unless you want footage. Of what? Me losing my temper? Me saying something about Caleb that could be used against me? Bridget had spent 40 minutes talking about Rosie's need for stability and family, and if I'd reacted the way I wanted to, if I'd told her exactly what I thought about her and her lawyer and her boutique furniture and her 2 phone calls in 14 months, that footage would have been very useful in front of a judge. I'd almost walked straight into it. My hands were steadier by the time I got up from the bench. I called the unknown number from a payphone at the gas station on Mercer. I know, I didn't know payphones still existed either, but this one was outside a station that I stopped at so rarely it felt safe. The line rang 4 times. A woman picked up and said nothing. You texted me today, I said, during lunch. Silence. Then, I wasn't sure you'd call. Her voice was older than I expected. Careful. Who are you? I asked. Someone who used to work for Thomas, she said. Someone who saw what he did to the last person who got in Bridget's way. She didn't tell me her name. I didn't push. She told me instead that Thomas had a contact who did private investigation work, the kind that wasn't exactly licensed, the kind that specialized in building cases for custody disputes and civil litigation. She told me this person had been watching me for 3 weeks. She told me there were photographs of me from outside Rosie's school, from the grocery store, from the parking lot of my therapist's office. Why are you telling me this? I said. Because Caleb was my nephew, she said. And what they're doing isn't right. She hung up. I stood at the payphone for a moment with the receiver in my hand, and then I set it down and drove home. I didn't sleep that night, but I wasn't lying there in a panic either. I was thinking, there's a difference. My father always said that when someone comes at you sideways, you don't meet them head on. You figure out what they're actually after. You find the thing they can't afford to lose. And then you wait. What did Bridget actually want? On the surface, custody of Rosie. But that didn't make complete sense to me. Bridget had never been particularly interested in Rosie when Caleb was alive. She'd been pleasant, appropriate, the kind of aunt who remembered birthdays and forgot everything else. And she had her own life. Thomas's work, their social calendar, the fundraiser committee she sat on. Taking in a 7-year-old full-time would disrupt all of that. So why? Caleb had left a will. Everything went to me and Rosie, which was normal, expected. But there was also the house. His childhood home, which our parents had signed over to him 3 years before they moved to Florida. It was paid off. It was worth a lot more than it had been when they'd bought it, and Caleb, being the trusting, paperwork-averse person he was, had made Bridget the secondary executor. I'd barely thought about that. I'd been too busy grieving. But Bridget had thought about it. If she had legal guardianship of Rosie, she would have significant leverage over decisions that affected Rosie's assets. Rosie, who was, as Caleb's daughter, named in the property trust. Rosie, who was 7 years old and couldn't speak for herself in any courtroom. It wasn't about wanting my daughter. It was about what my daughter was entitled to. I wrote it all down on a legal pad, and then I sat with it for a long time. In the morning, I called my father. He drove up from Florida, didn't ask many questions on the phone, just said, "I'll be there Wednesday," in the voice he uses when he's already decided something. He arrived with a duffel bag and a portable RF scanner he'd bought years ago and never returned. We swept my house first. Nothing. Then I described the camera in Bridget's living room, and he nodded the way he nods when something confirms something he already suspected. "They'll use whatever they got from that lunch," he said. "And if they didn't get what they wanted, they'll try again." "I know. You need to give them another chance to try," he said. "And this time, you control the conditions." We spent 2 evenings talking through it. My father has a way of planning that feels less like strategy and more like storytelling. He lays out the scene, imagines every person in it, anticipates what each of them wants. He'd spent 30 years doing it professionally, and it showed. Here's what we decided. Bridget had invited me to a charity event the following month. One of the fundraiser committees she sat on. She'd sent the invitation 3 weeks ago before the lunch, probably as a way to have a second opportunity if the first one didn't yield what she needed. I'd been planning to decline. Now I was going to accept. I called her and said I'd love to come. She sounded pleased in a way that wasn't quite natural. I said I was sorry if I'd seemed defensive at lunch. I said I was still processing everything and I appreciated her thinking about Rosie's future. I said all of it warmly and she softened, and by the end of the call she was calling me on, like she used to when Caleb was alive. Then I found an attorney. Not a general practice lawyer. A family law attorney who specialized in contested custody and estate disputes. Her name was not on any list I'd been given. I found her through my father's contact from his precinct days. She had a very small office and a very large reputation. Her first words to me were, "Tell me everything you know and don't leave anything out because you think it makes you look bad." I liked her immediately. Over 3 meetings we built a picture of what Bridget was likely doing and what we would need to counter it. My attorney wasn't interested in revenge. She was interested in evidence, documentation, and timeline. She told me to keep notes with dates and times on everything. She told me not to confront Bridget directly under any circumstances. She told me to be patient in a way that sounded like a warning. I was patient. In the weeks before the charity event, I kept my life as ordinary as possible. I took Rosie to school. I worked my shifts at the hospital. I'm a radiology technician, have been for 6 years. I went to the grocery store. I did the things I was supposed to do, and I did not call Bridget, and I did not drive past her house, and I did not do anything that could have been photographed and made to look like something it wasn't. What I did do was request a copy of Caleb's full estate documentation. I did it through my attorney, so there was a clear legal paper trail. What came back confirmed what I'd suspected. Bridget's position as secondary executor gave her certain rights to be consulted on decisions affecting trust assets. Rights that would become much more complicated if she also had any form of guardianship over Rosie. I also hired a private investigator, a legitimate one. He had an office in a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax preparation service, and he looked nothing like the investigators in television dramas, which I found reassuring. He started working the week before the event. 3 days later he called me. "The person who's been photographing you," he said, "he's not licensed in this state," which means anything he's produced may not be admissible, but more importantly, it means he's operating outside the law, and he hasn't been careful. I asked him what he meant. "He photographed your daughter at school," he said, "without consent, without authorization. That's a problem for him. And for whoever hired him." I sat down. "There's something else," he said. "Your sister-in-law's husband, Thomas, the charity foundation he sits on the board of. There's a tax filing discrepancy from last year, not my area but worth noting." I wrote it down. I added it to the file I was building. The one I kept in a locked box under my bed. The charity event was held at a converted warehouse space downtown that someone had decided to call a Vatimu. String lights, round tables, a live string quartet. I wore a green dress I'd bought in another life when Caleb was still alive, and we used to go to things like this together. I arrived 7 minutes late, so I didn't have to stand near the entrance and wait. My father was outside in a rental car. My investigator was inside. He'd obtained a press pass through a legitimate local outlet that covered nonprofit events. My attorney was at home with her phone on. Bridget saw me from across the room and waved with both arms, which was either genuine pleasure or very good performance. Probably some of both. Thomas nodded from next to her in the way he does, like he's conserving energy. I circulated. I drank half a glass of sparkling water. I talked to people I didn't know about things that didn't matter, and I watched. Bridget had arranged for me to be seated at her table. Next to me was a woman I'd never met, who introduced herself as Bridget's college roommate and immediately began asking me about Rosie in the particular way people do when they've been briefed. The questions were too specific, too interested in Rosie's routines, her relationship with me, whether she talked about Caleb. I answered everything vaguely and pleasantly and watched the woman's face for signs of where the conversation was supposed to go. Near the end of dinner, Bridget excused herself. Thomas stayed at the table. The college roommate was still talking. And then a man I didn't recognize sat down in the empty chair to my left. He was older, maybe 50, wearing a jacket that was slightly wrong for the occasion. He introduced himself with a first name I've already forgotten on purpose. And within 4 minutes of polite small talk, he mentioned that he was a family therapist who occasionally consulted on custody matters, that children Rosie's age often struggled after the loss of a parent, and that there were resources available, formal evaluations, that sort of thing, that could really help clarify what was in a child's best interest. I looked at him for a moment. "That's interesting," I said. "Could I get your card?" He handed it to me. I thanked him and turned back to the college roommate. Later in the parking lot, I handed the card to my investigator. "Find out who retained him," I said. My attorney called me the next morning before I'd had coffee. The investigator who was photographing you, she said. We filed a complaint with the state licensing board and submitted a police report regarding the school photographs. That's on the record now. Okay. The therapist at the event last night, he's real, but he has a prior complaint from a different custody case 3 years ago regarding inappropriate coaching of evaluations. We're pulling the documentation. Okay. And the estate filing, she said. I've consulted with a probate attorney. Bridget's interpretation of her executor role is significantly overstated. Her actual authority is quite limited. We can challenge any claim she makes on that basis. I sat down at my kitchen table. Through the window I could see Rosie in the backyard, dragging a stick along the fence like she was conducting something. What do we do now? I asked. Now, my attorney said, we send a letter. The letter was 6 paragraphs. I won't reproduce it here because it belongs to the legal record, not to this story. But what it said, in the careful and precise language my attorney prefers, was this: we know what you've been doing. We have documentation. We are prepared to file a formal response to any custody petition, and to include in that response evidence of unauthorized surveillance, the use of an unlicensed investigator who photographed a minor on school property, and the attempted coaching of a custody evaluation by a therapist for the prior complaint record. We are also prepared to refer the estate interpretation question to the probate court for a formal ruling. We sent it on a Thursday. Bridget called me on Friday. I didn't pick up. She called again Saturday. I let it go to voicemail. On Sunday, she sent a text. It said, "Can we talk? Just us, no lawyers." I showed it to my attorney on Monday. "Don't respond," she said. "Let them come to us." They came to us 11 days later. Thomas's attorney contacted mine. There were 3 rounds of communication that I was mostly kept away from, which was probably for the best. What I understood was that Bridget was withdrawing any consideration of a custody petition. In exchange, we would not pursue the complaint about the unlicensed investigator beyond what had already been filed. The licensing board would handle the rest. The woman who'd warned me. Caleb's aunt, the one who'd called from a number I never saved, sent me a letter 6 weeks later. No return address. Inside was a single index card with 4 words on it. He would be proud. I read it standing at my mailbox in the October cold, Rosie's backpack over one shoulder, because she'd decided halfway down the driveway that it was too heavy to carry herself. A truck went by. A dog barked somewhere on the next block. I thought about Caleb, the way he used to leave cabinet doors open without noticing, the way he'd said when we brought Rosie home from the hospital that he hadn't known what love actually was until that specific moment, the way he trusted people too easily and believed, genuinely believed, that most of them were doing their best. He wasn't wrong exactly, but he was optimistic in a way I couldn't afford to be anymore. I folded the card and put it in my jacket pocket. "Mom," Rosie said, "my arms are tired." "Your arms are tired," I said. "You've walked 30 feet. It feels like 100. I took the backpack. She immediately ran ahead to the door. Inside, I made hot chocolate and sat at the kitchen table while she told me about her day. A disagreement over who got to be the lead dinosaur at recess, a drawing she'd done that the teacher had put on the board, a tooth that was almost loose. I listened to all of it. I asked the follow-up questions in the right places. I was there in the room, not somewhere else in my head. That's the part that's hardest to explain to people who haven't been through something like this. The legal fight, the investigation, the sleepless nights, those things have an end. They're hard and then they're over. But what they take from you, the part where you're always waiting for the next move, always scanning for what doesn't belong, that takes longer to give back. Some nights I still catch myself calculating. Looking at a room, clocking the exits. Old habit now, maybe permanent. But that Sunday, with the hot chocolate and almost loose tooth, and the story about the lead dinosaur, I wasn't calculating anything, I was just there. That felt like enough? That felt, actually, like everything. The estate question was resolved through probate court 4 months later. Bridget's role as secondary executor was clarified to mean exactly what it said and nothing more. Rosie's share of the property trust was placed under a custodial account with me as the sole administrator until she turns 21. My father went back to Florida. He called me the week after the ruling and said, "You did good," in the voice he uses when he means more than that. My investigators sent me a final invoice and a note that said if I ever needed anything again, I knew where to find him. My attorney said she hoped we never had to speak professionally again, and that she meant that as a compliment. I still don't know for certain what Bridget told herself to justify what she did, whether she believed she was protecting some version of Caleb's legacy, whether it was always purely about the money, whether she'd started with good intentions and let something colder take over. I don't know, and I've decided it isn't mine to understand. What I know is this: someone reached out when I was sitting at the wrong end of a trap, and those 4 words, "She has someone here," gave me just enough to not react, not yet, to wait and think and look for what didn't belong. The rest I did myself. Rosie lost the tooth 2 weeks after the ruling. She put it under her pillow, and in the morning there was a folded dollar bill and a note that said, "You are braver than you know." I wrote that note at 1 in the morning, sitting on the edge of her bed while she slept, thinking that I hoped it was true. For both of us. I used to think that the people who hurt you the most were strangers, that the real dangers came from outside, from people who didn't know your name, didn't know what you'd lost, didn't know the shape of your grief. But Bridget knew all of it. She'd sat at the same table as me at Caleb's funeral. She'd held Rosie's hand during the burial, and she'd used everything she knew about us to build a trap she thought I was too tired to see. That's the thing about people who move in the dark. They count on you being distracted by your own pain. I was distracted. For months, I was so deep in the grief of losing Caleb that I barely registered the edges of what was happening around me. And maybe that's part of what I keep coming back to. Not bitterness toward myself for not seeing it sooner, but something quieter. A kind of respect for the fact that grief is its own intelligence. That it slows you down for a reason. You can't think your way through loss. You just have to be in it for a while before you can see clearly again. When I finally did see clearly, I didn't panic. I planned. That's the thing I want to be honest about. Because I think people sometimes hear a story like this, and they imagine it's about being fearless. It wasn't. I was scared every single day of those weeks. Scared of losing Rosie. Scared of losing Rosie. Scared of the legal system. Scared of what Bridget's next move would be. Fear was present the whole time. I just decided it didn't get a vote. What I learned from my father, from watching him work for 30 years, is that calm is a skill, not an emotion you're born with. A skill you practice under pressure until it becomes available when you need it. Bridget counted on me reacting. She'd set up the camera for exactly that purpose, and the only reason I didn't react was because someone gave me 4 words of warning and I'd spent enough time learning to trust my instincts over my impulses. That's the line I keep thinking about. Instinct over impulse. Impulse says, confront her right there at the table. Tell her exactly what you think of her and her boutique furniture and her lawyer. Instinct says, finish the salad. Watch the room. Wait. Bridget made choices, and those choices had consequences. Not because the universe is neatly organized around justice. I don't believe that. Not anymore. Not after losing Caleb the way we did. But because she overreached. She brought in an unlicensed investigator who photographed my daughter at school. She arranged for a therapist with a prior complaint record to sit next to me at a dinner and evaluate me without consent. Every move she made left a mark, and eventually those marks formed a pattern that no judge would overlook. Actions accumulate. That's not religion. That's just reality. The things you do quietly, believing no one is watching. They don't disappear. They wait. I think about Rosie growing up knowing some version of this story. Not the legal details, not yet. She's too young for that. But the shape of it, the part where her mother didn't fall apart, didn't lash out, didn't let fear make the decisions. I want her to know that intelligence isn't just about being smart. It's about being patient when every part of you wants to move. It's about building something careful when someone else is trying to tear things down. It's about knowing the difference between the moment to act and the moment to wait. And having the discipline to choose correctly even when it costs you. Rosie lost a tooth 2 weeks after everything was resolved. She fell asleep happy, completely unaware of how much had shifted in the months before. That's what I was protecting. Not an argument, not my pride, just that, a 7-year-old asleep with a loose tooth and no idea how hard her mother had worked to make sure the morning was still ordinary. That was worth every quiet, careful day of it.